Second. Great. So we're recording the session here so that people can enjoy it afterwards. This is the second in our series of discussions with faculty from the NYU Center for Cybersecurity. And we have here a really interesting professor, somebody who's doing amazingly interesting research and a very popular teacher amongst our students. Damon, I want to welcome you to our session. Thanks for spending some time with us.
Hi, Ed. Thanks for putting this together.
The way we've been starting is we've asked that you tell us a little bit about your personal journey, a little bit that brought you to computer science and to security. And there's a lot of students here that are on their own little journey, and I think they'd enjoy hearing about how you got to the position you're in now.
Oh boy, it was a very long and not so straight path, as probably most people travel within here. So I was lucky, I guess, to grow up in the generation that was kind of one of the first to grow up with computers around them. So I grew up in a house with first a Commodore video game system. It allowed for programming of BASIC. So I would program little choose your own kind of adventure games in BASIC within there. And then as the technology progressed, I had one of the original Macs in my house. And with that, you could do things like hypercard programming. So I guess it was interesting to kind of build within these computers and make them do stuff like that. And also I loved Lego. So I loved building both in the computer world and in the physical world, I guess, within there. And so when it came time to college, I think kind of the natural choice was to choose computer science within there. Back then it was not quite as common or popular a choice for the job prospects. It was a little bit more of a niche, probably, degree back then, but I really had a firm interest in learning about computers within there. So I did do my degree at the University of Colorado Boulder. Within there, I was extremely lucky. The University of Colorado Boulder, right next door, is a lot of the major government national science labs. We had some of the fastest internet connections, I think, in the world because of the atmospheric modeling research that was being done. Essentially, we got to piggyback onto that connection, which was a huge boon, I think. Some of the original supercomputers were there as well, so we got to play around with those within there. And so that really drove an interest in it. And I started getting interested in security as well, because I noticed that you could make these computers sometimes do things that they weren't intended to do within here. So I was a little bit of a prankster in college, and I would sometimes change people's wallpapers or make their CD trays eject on them and things like that. Within here, one of the only corporate companies at the time that was doing security outside of kind of the military setting was IBM. And so after college, I joined them in kind of the ethical hacking group within there and started doing kind of security audits of different customers within there. And that was definitely very enlightening to kind of understand security in the real world context, at least in the corporate world context, which was kind of the only context back then which computer security really mattered.
IBM was they had some folks in Boulder, right? Didn't they have big?
Exactly, yeah. So I also didn't have to move, and I love the mountains as well. So there's definitely a selfish reason as well. So yeah, so I didn't move too far. And yeah, I stayed around Boulder in that group. I did that for a little bit. And when I was an undergrad, there were no security classes within there. So University of Colorado hired a security professor, and they had one of their first actual security classes within there. And so I took it, and I took some more classes, and I kind of accidentally slipped into a master's degree at some point. Basically, you could transfer in 3 classes. After that, you couldn't transfer any more classes into a master's degree. So I decided to jump into the master's degree. It was during the economic downturn, unfortunately, within there. So IBM laid off a whole bunch of people, including myself, from their division. And so I kind of did the master's degree full time and did some consulting on the side as well within there. I applied to the PhD program, but I also applied to some other jobs, and I got a job working basically right for one of the government's organizations, the Department of Energy, through Sandia within there. And so I deferred my PhD and I decided to go work for there originally as a summer intern, and then they kind of lured me into a more permanent position. And I stuck around there for about a little over a year within there. And while I was there, I actually slipped in some research kind of in the evenings within there. And I published some work, and some of my friends kind of convinced me to actually go back and do the PhD at Boulder as well within there. So I returned there. I started doing my PhD. I kind of assumed that I wasn't going to stick in academia, and I was just kind of doing this for the passion of doing research. And so I continued to kind of do the consulting on the side, and I figured I would just kind of slip in the consulting role after the PhD. Unfortunately, I graduated during another economic downturn within here. Somewhat unfortunately and fortunately within there. So the fortunate part was that they had the economic relief programs, and one is actually funded a fellowship for me to go to the University of San Diego to do a postdoc there. And while there, I had a amazing time. I kind of expanded my horizons as to what computer security research could be within there. And so I kind of decided to stick with it and try and stay in academia through the professor route within there. So kind of a mixture of academic experience, corporate experience, government experience.
So it must have been the weather in San Diego and the beautiful mountains of Boulder that brought you to Brooklyn, right?
Exactly. That and just kind of my love for people in society, which I think kind of shades my research.
Tell us a little bit about your research. I've always been pretty impressed. You and I've presented a couple of times, and I always love listening to what you're doing. Give us some of the highlights.
Yeah, so I started out fairly technical in my research, and I was interested in, at the time, wireless was the new frontier in networking within there. And wireless brought about, I thought, a lot of privacy concerns because of how easy it is to eavesdrop on wireless communications. And so a lot of my earlier work was focused on privacy in that wireless setting and also in the wired setting. So I looked at things like Tor, and trying to understand, based on how they were implemented, how the privacy would really be in these systems within here. So it's kind of a fusion of actually analyzing these systems that were deployed and trying to look at them from this privacy perspective. And from this
What did you conclude about Tor and onion routing? Is it safe to say protect somebody's life from
theoretically, it was very strong. How it was implemented had some problems, and how it was being used by people in the real world had some issues as well. So we did some studies of that, and we kind of I think we drove some improved security of Tor through that by kind of pointing out some of the decisions that they had made in their actual implementation and how they were potentially hurting the security of the Tor network. And also looking at kind of, I guess what's called now like the usability aspects of Tor and how the system kind of lent itself to people using it poorly within there. And similar things in terms of wireless security. We proposed a completely encrypted wireless layer as part of some work that I did with Intel. Technically, the work was sound, but there was little demand at the time for that kind of change in the wireless protocol within there, and so it kind of went nowhere. And later on, people have started adopting parts of what we proposed, kind of slowly.
Very cool.
Within there. And then, yeah, I think as time went on, I kind of shifted away from the technical a little bit and more looking at kind of the social aspects of computer security as, like things like smartphones and laptops, and basically like people always being engaged with the computer and networked and somehow computing and networking kind of began to permeate people's lives, and this began to have real security and privacy impacts to other people's lives. And so I kind of got interested in that part, the financial harms that cropped out of like online commerce type systems, and more recently, the real privacy problems that happen by having us have a computer in our pocket all the time that's connected to the internet.
That's a lot of the work that you're known for. So take us through some of the juicier topics here. I know there's a lot of different directions we can head, but what are some of the more interesting problems that you're focused on now with your students?
Some more of the interesting current work, I think, has been looking at kind of different types of attackers. We've oftentimes focused on these really technically sophisticated and sometimes like profit motivated type attackers within here. But unfortunately, again, as almost a lot of our lives revolve around the online social networks and our phone and things like that, there's been a lot more, unfortunately, just kind of like the casual attackers that aren't that technically sophisticated, but perhaps abusive relationships and things like that lead to what is now kind of being called technology abuse within here. So kind of understanding how these less sophisticated attackers abuse technology within here, not necessarily through like some wowie zowie programming flaw, but just simply by misusing the features of the device.
So that expands the attack surface from when you might have been doing cybersecurity, or we didn't even call it cybersecurity then, but you were dealing with sophisticated attackers. But this concept of technology abuse, does it in fact greatly expand the aperture of what can be done?
It does, yeah. Unfortunately, yeah. When you have these attackers that might be able to just have the passwords, because a lot of times in relationships these days it's almost expected of you, or they can kind of shoulder surf or something like that within here, or they might just have physical access to the device and like notifications on people's phones and stuff like that, expose a lot of privacy sensitive information.
I know you collect a lot of empirical data and look at some real incidents and things. What are some things you've seen in that? Are there a couple of examples of technology abuse that come to mind that people might resonate with?
Yeah, so the real big one is on the mobile phones, kind of what is called either like spyware or stalkerware within here is kind of the terms I think that we're agreeing upon it. And this is sometimes purpose built. So sometimes it's, they are developing the spyware that can really integrate with the phone and, tap into the camera, the microphone, the call records, the SMS records, even sometimes tap into like the messaging apps like WhatsApp and Facebook and things like that, and basically monitor and stream all of that back to someone that wants to monitor someone's device. And also, of course, can't leave out the GPS and the location tracking within there. So yeah, so we're seeing oh, hello, I think I lost you guys for a little bit.
Yeah, I think we lost Ed. Let's give it a moment.
Okay. So I'm reading the comments here, and yeah, this is unfortunately a problem that we're seeing within here is that yeah, a lot of times unfortunately there's attackers that are either very close to you or that are somehow connected to you in the real world that decide to levy these kinds of attacks.
Mm-hmm. When these kinds of things occur, is it still the case that there's really not a good set of agreed upon controls for dealing with these problems? Are they still very much up for debate? Or is it more that we know exactly what to do but can't convince service providers, government. Which would you say? Is it still open technical questions, or
I
is it
think it's a
just
mix.
level? Mhm.
Right, if we wanted to have like, horrible usability of the system for the user, sure, we could probably lock down the phone to the point that it would be really hard to get into, but then there would probably be a large chance of like the legitimate owner of the phone being locked out and owning a very expensive paperweight or something like that within there. So I think it is an open question. Again, this balance of allowing the device to function correctly by the legitimate user, but keeping out illegitimate people
Interesting.
within here.
You've done some work in some adjacent areas like automotive and some other areas that might be references, IoT and so on. Tell us a little bit about that work. That's super interesting.
Yeah. So this was again kind of looking at everyday kind of systems. In this case, the automobile, and I think this one kind of crept up on everyone. Is that at some point an automobile transformed into this, basically like computers, network computers with wheels attached to them at some point within here. And I think it crept up on everyone, including the auto manufacturers themselves. I don't think they realized that they had accidentally slipped into the computer software development business as much as they had within there. And so that kind of spurred our interest in understanding the security of these systems within here, because we had realized that it had just pervaded these automobiles to such a large extent, right? When you hit like the gas pedal, there is no physical connection between that gas pedal and your engine. When you press down on that pedal, it gets transformed into some electrical impulses that go over the wire, connect to a computer on the engine, and then that regulates the fuel to oxygen mixture on your engine within here. Same thing for your brakes. There is no physical connection between that brake pedal and your brakes. It's again completely electronic in nature with another computer system controlling the brakes within there. And this has made the cars very efficient and safe within here, right? So you get many more miles to the gallon than you used to, and right, the cars are much more safe. We have like anti-lock brakes and differential braking for when you skid and things like that. But it also increased the attack surface area of these vehicles, and it didn't seem like anyone was trying to understand this part of the problem. And so we basically bought two cars. At the time, we couldn't say who they are, but now we can. We bought two Chevy Impalas, basically because they were the cheapest cars that had the what was called at the time like the telemax unit, essentially a cellular connection attached to a GPS unit in the car that if you got into an accident, it could call for help. Within there, again, making it much more safe to drive the car. But right, this allowed attackers to remotely connect to your car potentially from the internet. And if there were vulnerabilities in that telemax unit, which unfortunately we found that there were, they could take over that telemax unit. And then from there, we looked at the security of the rest of these components, and we found that they had left like diagnostic messages basically open to all of these what are called electronic control units, like the brake control module. So you could effectively send like one message, one diagnostic message, and lock the brakes on someone's car or disable the brakes so that they couldn't be enabled within here. So just figuring out this one diagnostic message allowed us to do these attacks within here. And so it took us a year or two and a lot of very smart people and a lot of funding from the National Science Foundation and other places to figure this out. But once we did figure it out, we could essentially record a song on an MP3 player, and we could play this back, compromising that telemax unit and forcing it to send this packet to enable or disable the brakes.
Thanks.
Within here. So this is a recurring problem in cybersecurity, right? Of it's expensive to develop the attack the first time, but then every other time you launch the attack is very cheap, typically.
Seems like these vulnerabilities. I remember watching Charlie Miller control van and drive it off the road in St. Louis or something, or sort of
Yeah,
spectacular
so
demo.
Charlie Miller replicated some of our work and did it much more publicly.
Yeah. Yeah.
This probably gets to the ethics of computer science. I don't know if some of his experiments were that safe or particularly
He
ethical.
did that on a live highway. I thought that
Exactly, yeah. So
really
I
weird.
felt
That could have been a track you could have done it on.
right. I felt that it was very
Weird.
dangerous. So when we did our initial experiments, we did it on a closed track.
Yeah.
It happened that one of the researchers was also a race car driver, and so he had all the safety gear and safety training.
Yeah.
And did that. So when we did the experiments, we did it in I felt much more ethical and safe and control way.
Let me ask a question. You and I both have sort of made a living looking at vulnerabilities that come through sloppiness in just engineering and new things. You look and you go, oh, it's sloppy. But the question for automotives, like particularly with autonomous vehicles, is whether there's some real showstoppers at the design level. Like, are there some things when you look at this where you say, well, that's not just a matter of engineering, that's a big issue. Like, for example, autonomous vehicles communicating with their environment, then the environment could lie to you. And there's all weird things that come up that even if you did the software correctly, that just infrastructure wise are worrisome. What are your thoughts on that? Are you sort of an optimist when you think about autonomous vehicles flying around at 80 miles an hour or something?
I agree. There definitely are some dangers. I don't know if you talked, because I think Brendan was the first one that you talked to, and he's done a lot of interesting work attacking AI systems within there. And there's definitely those kind of problems that creep up. There will definitely be those issues, but again, sometimes you have to take a pragmatic view sometimes of security and safety within here, and right, and that the current kind of security and safeties of automobiles is imperfect.
Yeah. You know, one of the participants, Alina, asked whether you feel like it's the duty of scientists to find these things, or, you know, is it maybe the manufacturer's duty, or, you know, is it up to hackers? Certainly will find them eventually. Like, whose kind of responsibility is it to find these problems?
I mean, in an ideal world, it would be the manufacturer's
Yeah.
responsibility, I feel, but the problem is that a lot of times the incentives aren't there for the manufacturers to invest, because as I said, right, it took us, you know, millions of dollars and a lot of really smart people, probably that were horribly underpaid, to find these vulnerabilities in the automobiles. And so I think realistically, our best hope is for the academics to find the vulnerabilities and to ideally disclose them in a ethical way. And so when we found these issues with the Chevy Impala, at the time we made the decision to not name Chevy or the Impala as the target of our attack, because we felt that the problems were much more systemic. And we also, there were no solutions at the time, and it was going to be very hard for the automotive industry to patch the problems that we had. And so we didn't release full details except to the automotive manufacturers themselves, the attack. So I feel that academics can do it, but they have to do it ethically. And then my concern when hackers find it is that, you know, sometimes they're there for the limelight and things like that. And I mean, Charlie Miller had a big impact in driving security within there with his very public demonstrations. And I feel like his timing was actually reasonably well, because we had told the automotive industry 4 or 5 years before that of the problems within there. So they had the chance to stand up the product security groups and things like that to start working on these problems within there. But if we had taken kind of the same tack as Charlie Miller back 4 or 5 years ago, I feel like we might have potentially done more harm than good.
It's also, you and I are involved in academia, and I think training graduate students, like your PhD students and so on, to have the habit of responsible disclosure, that's what we would call it, and to be ethical. I think that's really important. Like, I also understand, you know, you can get more press, and maybe there's a place for that. but I don't think it's in academia. I've always admired within the center, within NYU, that I can't think of a case where there's been an irresponsible activity, and I think the students benefit from that treatment. So,
yeah, I think this is definitely something that we need to kind of pick up in the security and just broadly in the engineering training. Is this, right? Because there's entire classes and disciplines dedicated to ethics, and so bringing some of that thought process into this domain, I think, is very helpful.
yeah. So what are some things you see happening? We got a few minutes here. What are some things you expect to be working on with your students in the next few years? What are areas do you think AI finds its way into your work? Or there's some things that are themes that are on a lot of prospective students' minds. What do you see in the next few years for
We have been looking at AI. I think the AI that's been integrated in social media systems
Mhm.
is particularly interesting. So understanding attacks against kind of the filtering and recommendation systems the social media companies have deployed, because these can be especially dangerous. So we've been looking at it particularly in like the political context
Mhm.
and kind of the disinformation context and things like that.
I think certainly in the next 12 months, that's going to play itself out in front of our eyes. I think, the degree to which social media finds its own role. It's funny how your work, maybe as much as any of the faculty members, does seem to touch a lot of social and also technical and ethical things. I'm guessing that's by personal preference. Does that mean?
Yeah, like I said, there's definitely a personal preference for that. And when you said, why Brooklyn, why New York, I think that's part of it, is that I like to be engaged kind of in the fabric of society,
yeah,
in community. And that's one of the nice things about NYU and that, right? That we right, by design, we don't have like this ivory walled off campus. We have this campus that is integrated with the rest of the city.
Have you found with your own graduate students that that's been an important part of the experience? I know for me, I'm New Jersey, New Yorker myself. I love it. But for a lot of kids, like there might be some folks listening right now, who, in maybe a region that doesn't look anything like New York City. How easy has it been for your students to come to the big city and integrate and get comfortable?
It's definitely an experience for them.
Mm-hmm.
My students come from all over the place within here. And yeah, definitely the ones that weren't familiar with the city, it definitely is kind of a new experience for them. But I think that's part of college and learning. Within there is that experience. And yeah, especially for my particular research, it's very valuable to have those things. Like when we've been looking at tech abuse and intimate partner violence, domestic violence, and that we can kind of integrate with the city and the resources that the city are providing in this area, and try and bolster those through our research.
I know the partnership with New York City, and in particular the security team there, the CISO in the city. It's been fun to do that. I've done a couple of hackathons, and it's a really nice partnership. Well, we got about a minute left. I want to ask if you have any parting advice for the folks listening. An awful lot of them are mulling over graduate degrees, and does it make sense? And it's funny how in your own life you went back and forth between academia and jobs. And what advice do you have for people who are considering maybe an advanced degree?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's definitely value in just kind of always learning within there, kind of always staying current and always learning. And so that might take the form of a more formal degree, or it might just take the form of a few classes that you drop into every once in a while. But I feel like that without that, I feel like I wouldn't have grown in my career as much as I could have within here. So I find that experience very rewarding. And even though I'm a professor, I do classes online. I stop by people's lectures and things like that, because there's always things I can learn and understand.
Well, I know you're very popular. I know you and I are both involved in the program with the law school. We're teaching the students a little bit about cybersecurity in that program. So I
Right,
want
that's been wonderful. Yep.
it's fun, right? They're
yeah,
different students. I think it's great.
yep.
Yeah.
And yeah, this coming fall, we're going to do, NYU kind of has these tentpole classes that they're standing up. So we're going to be doing one. They all had to be one word, and so ours is going to be on trust. And I think it will be really interesting to design a broader course on trust and cybersecurity.
That sounds good. I hope some of the people who are listening are part of our community when you run that course. So. Well,
Yeah.
we're at the top of the hour. I want to thank you for making a half an hour for us. Always great to catch up. And I'm sure if people have any questions, they can reach you at our website. And if they want to hear a little bit about your research group and the work you're doing, I would imagine that'd be a good place for them to.
Yeah. Feel free to drop me an email. Not hard to find, McCoy at nyu.edu. And yeah, thanks, Ed, for setting this up.
Oh, it's been fun. And listen, have a great day. And everybody, thanks so much. And we'll see you all next week with our third session. Everybody have a great day. And please stay safe, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.